I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is Tom Whitmore. Tom is a UFO researcher and a longtime board member of MUFON. He's appeared on many podcasts, radio shows, and YouTube channels to share his knowledge and insight about the topics we'll be discussing. Retired from the financial industry with decades of experience examining and analyzing documents and data, his career in finance almost seems like it was in preparation for his role as a document analyst and researcher. Since retiring, Tom has devoted much of his personal time to the study of the phenomena, and more specifically, disinformation and counterintelligence programs being used against members of the UFO community, including the MJ-12 controversy. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. So welcome back to Dead Hand Radio, Tom. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me on your program.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, my friend. So my intro is a little bit impromptu. I didn't give you a chance to look at it. Did I miss anything, or was it accurate?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
No objections.
Great. How's things been going since we last talked? It's been a few months since we actually did talk. And the episode that we recorded just released about a month ago. Was it a few weeks ago or a month ago? But it was several months before that we had recorded it, and we hadn't really talked since then. So how are things going for you?
They're going well. I've been able to, since COVID, I've had to, like everyone else, I've had to adjust my activities, my research activities. And instead of going to the National Archives every day, I'm doing a lot of research of secondary sources and books and internet articles and documents that I can turn up. The thing is now, Andrew, you can do so much research online. And there will be times when I'd like to go to the National Archives and go through, boxes of documents. But right now, I'm concentrating on writing my research chapters, my research papers that will eventually become chapters, hopefully in a book someday. And last summer, I did some research on my first paper, MJ-12, the counterintelligence angle. And then I started working on a really extremely detailed timeline of the Paul Benowitz affair. And I have that on file. I haven't posted that yet, but I went into this subject of before MJ-12. And I did my research, and I wrote about a 3,000 word research paper on that and posted it on my blog. And it's concerned with some things that were going on before the MJ-12 controversy became subject of discussion in the UFO community. And currently, I've posted that, and now currently I'm working on a new paper concerning psychological warfare and strategic deception, and how it is connected either directly or indirectly to the UFO problem.
Well, it sounds like you've been busy, and I did read, you sent me some of the information. I read the paper that you wrote titled Before MJ-12. Very interesting stuff, and it sounds like you cover in depth some of the things that we talked about on the previous episode. So I'd like to get a lot more into that and talk about those things, because we only briefly touched on some of that stuff, like the Doty and the Benowitz affair. But there's a lot more in there that we didn't even talk about. So before we get into that, you've been studying this particular topic, the disinformation angle, for how long?
I've been interested in it since I got into the UFO field actively around 1990. And the original set of MJ-12 documents came out in 1980, 1986 or 87. And by the time I became active in the UFO field, it was really a hot controversy. It was really being, the documents were being scrutinized and all kinds of debates were going on. And when I first saw the Eisenhower briefing document, my first impression was that it must have something to do with espionage somehow. And so off and on, now, I was employed full time up until 2019. So, and I was raising a family and holding down a full-time job. So I wasn't able to devote full time to the subject. But over those years, I was collecting books and I was collecting articles and I was talking to people and doing a lot of thinking about it. So, the subject just got to a point where it fascinated me. And the reason why it fascinates me is there's some kind of a connection between some of these alphabet agencies and the UFO community. And, we can go into that in more detail because it's really somewhat multifaceted. And, there is something to it.
I would really like to get into that right now because what I'm curious about is from the perspective of somebody who studied documents, and not just documents, but articles and books written by other researchers who've also studied documents and talked to witnesses as well. Is there any hard evidence that links these counterintelligence or disinformation programs to the U.S. government?
The most direct link that I've seen is, like I mentioned in my paper, the counterintelligence angle was from Greg Bishop. And Greg Bishop is the author of the book Project Beta, and he's well known in UFO circles. And Greg Bishop became a friend of Bill Moore in the 1980s, and he was there when Bill Moore gave his tell-all speech at the MUFON Symposium in 1989. So he and Bill Moore had kept up a friendship. Well, on one radio show, I think it was on Don Ecker's show back in the 1990s, Moore said that everyone that was following the story wanted to know who Falcon was. And Falcon Richard Doty had been accused of being Falcon and so on and so forth. But people like me that were really following it pretty closely, I didn't think that Doty was actually Falcon, and I wanted to know who Falcon was. And in a radio program, Bill Moore said that he would reveal the name at the proper time. Well, the proper time probably being when that person became deceased. So I think it was around the year 2000, 2002 that Greg Bishop was talking to Bill Moore about the subject. And Greg Bishop had done some research and tried to figure out who Falcon was. And Bill Moore finally admitted, he gave him the name and affirmed the name of Harry Rositsky. Now, Harry Rositsky was a real live, bona fide employee of the CIA. And even though Bill Moore has not publicly come out and said that his case officer, so to speak, was Falcon, it's all indications to me are that Falcon was Bill Moore's case officer, the person that he ultimately reported to during his career as an informant to AFOSI. Now, I think what was happening was they were employing pretty standard techniques of planting rumors, planting stories, planting documents in the UFO community. And then I think they wanted to see where it went, where the information went. They wanted to see what effect it was having. And Bill Moore and possibly others who had been recruited was feeding information back to, ultimately, I think, to Falcon. And so they had an idea. They got this feedback loop going. Now, why were they doing that? One theory is that they suspected that there were there were moles in military or intelligence or military industrial complex, and they were using the UFO community as a means to possibly track some of this down. Now, Moore had gotten into this because he was trying to get to the bottom of the UFO mystery, and he was trying to use this relationship to get more inside information about what the government knew about UFOs. And I think he had been promised that, but I don't know if he got the information that he was hoping to get. And I assume that Falcon and AFOSI, or possibly the CIA, or whomever, the Defense Intelligence Agency, I assume that they were getting some information. I don't know if they got all the information that they wanted, about these so-called spies. But there had been a concern since the 1970s that the Soviets might be utilizing UFO people as well. So that was a concern. That's the most direct link that I know of. Now, I can mention other things that are a little more indirect, but that's the basic idea.
So these counterintel ops that were being fed through the UFO community were to root out spies and foreign adversaries that were working against the interest of the U.S. government. Is that right?
Yes. And we want to remember, too, that, there were some very classified activities going on, such as Star Wars type programs. There were the stealth programs, the bomber and the fighter. And one concern is protecting the classified information. So they're always concerned about leaks of classified information and data. And that was another motivation, I'm sure.
Okay. Now, is it legal for the CIA to run ops on American civilians?
I don't think that it's strictly legal, but I think what it comes down to, Andrew, is when it comes to national security, what the government considers to be national security, that they can do, I think, what they need to do to protect state secrets. Now, I don't know if it's the CIA that runs that, or, it's probably more like AFOSI in our world, or the Defense Intelligence Agency. Sometimes if you have domestic espionage going on here in the U.S., the FBI ultimately gets involved. But I think that there could be a dual purpose, because not only are they protecting classified information and programs, and not only are they concerned about espionage, but they may be wanting to know what we know about what's going on in the UFO world. What UFO sightings are taking place, what landings are taking place, what abductions are taking place. They may want to be knowing that too. And there's no rule that says that they can only be concerned with one thing. They can be, getting two birds with one stone. I call it the double principle. Many times, if you study carefully government history, they have more than one thing that they're accomplishing.
Well, yeah, it makes sense to run operations efficiently, to cover multiple facets. So, according to the bullet points that you sent over to me, the government or the entities. Now, would you consider these sanctioned operations ran by legitimate government agencies, or would this be something of a rogue section of part of the government that's doing these ops without the knowledge of the higher ups? Kind of a breakaway civilization type of situation.
I don't think it's a rogue operation. Richard Doty, who is central character in all this. In fact, most of this goes back to Richard Doty. But he stated on numerous occasions that when they get into a situation, they confer at the field level, and reports are written, and then they're run up to headquarters. And the higher ups in Washington, D.C. ultimately decide what is to be done. And when it comes to protecting, classified information or whatever, the ground level people, the field level people like Doty, who is a counterintelligence agent in AFOSI, they're pretty much given their marching orders, and then they execute. So, but there's human nature. You take police. Sometimes police do things that aren't exactly legal, and I'm sure in government sometimes, maybe strictly legally, they may not be supposed to be doing something, but they do it anyway, and that's certainly possible. I mean, that's just reality. But I don't think it's a big rogue operation.
Okay. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse about the whole scenario, but the fact that it's happening, and people like you and me who are just searching for the truth could potentially be targeted as for one of these programs, whatever they are. And then we'll go through the details of what those programs look like and how people are targeted. But this might seem a little off topic or a little bit weird, but it's something that has popped up a couple times. Now, the flat Earth movement is almost seems like they're trying to connect themselves with the UFO community. And this is just an observation of my own. I don't have any evidence really to support that, but it just seems like there is a big push for the flat Earth movement to kind of latch on to the UFO community. First of all, does that seem, have you observed this in your own research? And also, could that be part of the government trying to discredit members of the UFO community by attaching this pseudoscience belief system that the Flat Earth Society is trying to push?
Well, I don't follow Flat Earth myself. I do keep, I look at Twitter and I look at Facebook, and I listen to certain shows on YouTube and so on and so forth. But I don't follow Flat Earth, so that thought never occurred to me. The Flat Earth idea is so patently absurd that I haven't condescended to even look at it. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. Anything's possible. But all kinds of people are running around with all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories these days. So I try to focus on my little area, my little world.
The only reason I brought that up is because I've been contacted by people within the Flat Earth movement to come on my podcast. And I know other podcasters have also been contacted. So it just seems like they're trying to get people that are talking about UFOs to bring them on their shows so that they could either legitimize themselves as one way to look at it, but also if it's a disinfo operation, attach themselves to UFO researchers and podcasters to discredit those people. That's just my theory. Might be a little bit conspiratorial, but
well, you may be right. You may be right.
Okay. Now, so let's talk about some of the programs and the strategies that are being employed for these programs to actually have an effect. Um, One of the things that you mentioned is that they will plant stories. So a story that has been planted is the one that you mentioned a couple of times already, is the Paul Benowitz and Richard Doty story. Was there anything? Well, there was some stuff before that. Why don't you run it down? Some of the stories that have been planted.
Well, I don't. Well, there have been documents that have been planted in my paper about before MJ-12. I basically started with the series of incursions on northern tier military bases where they had nuclear missiles or nuclear storage. Now, this is actually a theme that's basically continuing almost up to the present time, of alleged UFO sightings and related to nuclear facilities. But what interested me was that Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett, they requested documentation on it. Now, a story had already been run in the National Enquirer, written by Bob Pratt, about these whole incidents of unidentified objects appearing over these missile silos and such. And what I found strange was, now Barry Greenwood doesn't find this strange, but I found it strange, that basically the Joint Chiefs of Staff released a number of documents about the whole thing. And Barry Greenwood felt that, well, it was already out in the press. But why would they release that material? I mean, you would think that would be the last thing they would want to release. But there's still the question: was there some foreign intrusion? Was it really a UFO, or were they tests being security tests being conducted? The military does do that. So I just found it very strange that the government would release documentation on that.
Is that the Ellsworth document that you're talking about right there?
No, that's some documentation. You can see a lot of that, a lot of the content about that in the book Clear Intent, which is something of a UFO classic. Now the Ellsworth document came, right along after that, and Bill Moore stated that the Air Force thought that somebody was leaking, not necessarily UFO information, but somebody was leaking information to the National Enquirer. And the idea of the Ellsworth document, it was Moore said that, and he said this because Doty probably told him this, that it was a counterintelligence training exercise. And what happened was they sent this letter to the National Enquirer that was mostly disinformation. A small amount of it was based on a peripheral event. And the idea was that if they sent this letter to the National Enquirer, then they would come back to the Air Force base, to whatever contacts they had, and then the Air Force could detect who was leaking information. I don't know if that worked or not, but that was the idea.
Was let's see. So was that the story about the aliens that pulled out their blasters and disintegrated the airmen's weapons?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And, Bob Pratt, who was a reporter for the National Enquirer, and, people normally associate the National Enquirer with a lot of nonsense, but Bob Pratt was actually a very professional reporter. And he investigated into things, and he was an investigative type reporter. He knew how to dig into information. He knew how to gain contacts and get information. So he was, at least in that particular exercise, I think he was a target.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, well, have you uncovered any information to support the theory that the National Enquirer and magazines like that are used to do some kind of a soft disclosure? Like the government wants to let this information out, but if they give it to legitimate reporters, that it would have a negative effect. But if they do it through these less legitimate publications, that it's a way of conditioning people over a period of time to get used to the idea that this is a reality.
Yes, that's certainly a well-known notion, and it goes along with a lot of these documents that we've seen. And the effect is, now assuming that it's some kind of program to accomplish this, the effect is that the ideas, the memes, seep into the public consciousness, while at the same time you always have plausible deniability. You can just say, oh, that's a phony document, when you're talking officially. But unofficially, the memes and the ideas and the notions and these attitudes start seeping into society, and perhaps one reason to monitor the UFO community is to see what kind of effect it's having.
Was there something about Carl Bernstein that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, Carl Bernstein wrote an article. It's pretty dated now, but I haven't read it in a while, and the paper I'm working on right now, I'm going to go back and read it again because I'm going to use it as a reference. But Carl Bernstein wrote about how many contacts the CIA had recruited in the journalistic field, and this Bernstein had enough credibility that I think people took his allegations seriously. That you're asking, can the CIA legally operate in the U.S., and perhaps strictly legally they don't, but on the other hand, they have a job to do in protecting the United States. And how they do that, I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on how they do that, but they may have their reasons. For example, there may be some event, some political event or international event occur, and the government may go to the New York Times or the Washington Post and say, please don't publish this article. And they, the New York Times and the Washington Post and these major outlets, they have so-called journalistic integrity, but the government people are also their sources for their stories, so they try to maintain a relationship. And I think what was shocking about the article that Bernstein wrote was the number and the breadth of contacts that the CIA had in the journalistic field. Had or has.
Is there a connection with Project Mockingbird? I think that's the name of the program that the CIA had, where they were using CIA agents to go to work in the media, or the media was being used as informants to dispense information that the CIA gave them. I can't remember exactly what the details of that program were, but it sounds like what you're talking about. Is there a relation to that?
Yes, I think so, and I don't want to sound too definitive about that because, like I said, I'm getting ready to go back and reread that article. And
Okay.
if I had done that before this, I could answer you more definitely. But I think that's the case.
Okay. So it sounds like you're really just getting started on this whole topic. Now, you mentioned that the surveillance element is also pretty is a component of this whole disinfo operation that's been going on. And it takes place at UFO conferences through publications and media, as well as the internet. What kind of surveillance are we talking about? Physical, digital, or just looking for patterns? Or do they actually have like agents tailing people that may be high profile UFO researchers?
No, I don't think so, unless maybe they suspect somebody may be leaking classified information or may be engaging in some form of espionage. I don't think that they would physically surveil people in the UFO community. They can always, if they're going to do something like that, they can make friends, make contacts, and have somebody else in the community do it for them. But I think what's going on is just open source monitoring. You know, the MUFON organization, we put on a convention every year, a symposium. So do other UFO conference organizations. And anyone in the public can go. I mean, if you can pay for a ticket, you can attend. But Richard Doty has said, you know, more than once that he's gone to UFO conferences and seen upwards 10, 20 people that he knew there, you know, from the intelligence community. And he said you know, someone once asked, how can you tell who they are? He said, well, they're neatly groomed, they're well dressed, and they tend to stick together and stand apart from the crowd. But they're there to get an understanding and some insight about what issues the UFO field is addressing. And I suppose they can develop contacts. There's nothing illegal about that. I mean, you or anyone else can go to a UFO conference and talk to people and make friends and make contacts. So they do that. Now, when I mentioned magazines and articles, I mean, they can also subscribe to, you know, UFO magazines. They can subscribe to the UFO MUFON Journal. They can, you know, do that. And they can go on the internet and read the same articles that you and I and everyone else reads. Where I think the world has changed, though, Andrew, is with the internet. It's so much easier to plant information. You know, plant opinions, stories, memes, rumors, and people can do, you know, all this can be done anonymously. You can't trace it back to its source. And
Right.
That is what I think is the new world that we're living in now.
Yeah, there is a lot of that out there, anonymous, and it's kind of become almost a trend in the UFO community that some high profile, I call them high profile, but these are people who are well known in the UFO community who put out information based on an anonymous source. Now, that source is unknown to anybody except for the person that's putting out the information. I've seen this multiple times. I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, but what is the chance that that anonymous source is a disinfo agent feeding that person information or disinformation?
Well, there's always that chance, and I think for responsible people, the most conservative UFO researchers just discard that automatically. They won't accept anything from an anonymous source. And, you know, your rock rib conservative researchers like Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldrich and Paul Dean and John Greenwald, if it's not an officially released government document, they don't want to be concerned with it.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work out of actual information that is available, and then maybe form some insights about what may be going on with us. And there's a lot of information out there in books and articles. I have contacts too, and I've looked at documents at the National Archives, and there are documents. There are a lot of documents available on the CIA website. You can gain books from archive.org. The NSA has UFO documents on their website, and so on. And these agencies are getting to the point where they're so besieged with UFO FOIA requests that I think they just organized some of this information and put it on their website and say, here it is, go at it. The things that have been released. But the problem is that's only what's been released. We don't know what they have that is still classified and has not been released.
So what we were talking about a little bit with the members of the UFO community having these anonymous sources, there's also another component of the disinformation operation, which involves recruiting assets. How often have you run across this in your research? How often does this actually happen?
The only one that has come out and admitted it, as far as I know, is Bill Moore. He admitted that in 1989. And God bless him for that, because if he hadn't come out and made that confession, we might still today not really realize about some of the things that go on in this area. Bill Moore said that there were several others that he knew of that had been recruited, but he didn't give out their names. Now, one thing that was very concerning to me was that in an interview, Richard Doty said that at a meeting of, I think it must have been AFOSI people and maybe some other alphabet agencies, but they were tasked. Now this is in the 1980s, but they were tasked with developing 2 to 3 contacts each in the UFO field. Now that was worldwide, but I think there was something like 120 people in the room. So if only half of them were in the operating in the United States, and you're talking about 120, 180 contacts in the UFO field? That's a huge number.
Yeah.
Now, are they doing nefarious things? I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily think that. They may just be monitoring what's going on in the UFO field, and maybe the higher-ups want to know where and how some of these memes are circulating around. What kind of effect are they having? Now, I personally don't know of anyone that's been recruited. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And no one's called me at 2 a.m. and said, "Would you like to be a CIA agent?" Okay. I haven't gotten there yet.
Depends on what the pay is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have not had anybody contact me. Of course, I've only been doing this for, I like to say 6 months, but it's been a little bit more than that now. So I guess this is really kind of speculation. If you don't mind doing that for a little bit, what would it look like if an agency tried to recruit somebody? What are some of the things to look out for? Because there's researchers, there are active investigators, there are podcasters, there are people with blogs who just write about stuff that they find. So those are some of the people that could be actively recruited. There's also experiencers, people who've had contact or potential contact, and sightings. What are some of the ways that an agency or an agent of an agency would try to recruit any of those people?
Well, it may not be as cloak and dagger as we might want to think, but one of the, based on the study that I've done in this field, there are some basic principles that are involved in recruitment. And ordinarily, you want to know what motivation would a person have to cooperate with you. And those can be ideological, they can be political. I think in Bill Moore's case, it was ego. They knew how to appeal to his ego, and he, I think, calculatedly decided to get into that. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be an obvious recruitment. For example, foreign intelligence agencies and CIA, they mix with people at social gatherings, at cocktail parties and conventions and such. And they get to know people, and then, maybe over time, if a relationship sticks, then they might ask the person to do some small task for them. And now this gets more into the espionage side of things, and you've recruited somebody. By the time they realize they're recruited, it's too late. Okay. Now, I don't think it has to be quite that cloak and dagger in the UFO field. I think that people can just mix with us, get to know us, and then casually ask questions that might provide information that they're interested in. I can't really see it going much further than that.
Do you think the Richard Doty and Paul Benowitz case could be almost a case study in how a recruitment would take place? Although that was under false pretenses, but is that accurate?
Well, the Paul Benowitz case was a little bit different because Benowitz was basically what in the intelligence field is known as a walk-in. Paul Benowitz had been surveilling Kirtland Air Force Base with his cameras and his movie cameras and with his scientific equipment. He was seeing things that he thought were UFOs, and then he approached Kirtland Air Force Base security, a man by the name of Ernest Edwards. And, eventually Doty was brought into the case. But it wasn't like Doty or AFOSI was going out and scouring Albuquerque trying to find an agent, and they recruited Paul Benowitz. It didn't act like that. It didn't work like that at all. Paul Benowitz came to them, and they realized that he was coming across information that was highly classified, not necessarily UFOs, but he was coming across highly classified information. And AFOSI, Doty and AFOSI and his supervisors there at Kirtland, they ran it at the flagpole to Washington, and the orders came back on how to deal with the situation.
Yeah, which is wrong, 100% wrong. And we talked about that at length on our last podcast episode. So if anybody wants to hear more about that particular case, I recommend checking out that previous episode that we did. And it just came out a couple of weeks ago, so it's still relatively fresh on the channel. Now, so besides what we've talked about, we talked about the surveillance, stories getting planted so they could find the trail of where the information is coming from and where it's ending up, the recruitment of assets. What are some of the other highlights that you would like to touch on about these disinformation operations that have been going on for almost since the beginning?
Well, there was an example that Bill Moore gave. AFOSI and probably Doty started a rumor in the 1980s that the government was working on a training film, I think, regarding UFOs. And there were all these rumors spreading around the community. Well, Bill Moore stated that what was actually happening was the Department of Energy was working on a training film, and it was actually that. So that's one example of a rumor that was planted in the UFO community. Obviously, my work gets me into looking at these forged documents or these questioned documents, and there has been a pattern of these documents entering into the UFO field, from the 1970s on, all through the 80s, all through the 90s. We had Serpo in the 2000s. We had Dan Burrish in the 2000s. In 2017, we had the so-called ultra top secret document. And though probably not a planted document from an alphabet agency, but even more recently we've had the Admiral Wilson controversy. So this is, if you look at the pattern of these documents over time, this is a long-term issue.
Mm-hmm.
We're going back 30, 40 years or more of question documents being planted in the UFO community. Now, one thing I am getting into is I've been taking a look at the Robertson panel. And what happened was in 1952, there was the Washington, D.C. incident. And there was also a lot of UFO activity going on in the country, a lot of UFO reports. And so the CIA director at the time, Walter Bedell Smith, was approached by President Truman, and Truman wanted to know, how is the Air Force handling all this? So, the conversation started at the CIA end, and they looked at some various options, but ultimately they decided on hiring a panel of scientists to look at some data and then file a report. And this became known as the Robertson Panel Report in colloquial terms. And what the Robertson panel did was they looked at some reports, they looked at some films, they looked at other information, and they filed their conclusions, being that UFOs weren't a threat to national security, and that UFO groups should be monitored, and that UFOs should be debunked. So now this was in January of 1953. That was a long time ago. There's an interesting article by Brad Sparks in Jerry Clark's UFO Encyclopedia about how the Air Force played the CIA in all of this, because the Air Force wanted to get control of the narrative. They were being hounded with these UFO sightings and reports. They were being hounded for more information. And they wanted the problem to go away. So, we have the Robertson panel recommending that UFOs be debunked. Now, I can't say there's a direct chain of custody with this, but if we look at UFO history, what have we had? We've had Donald Menzel, big, huge debunker. We had the Condon Report at the end of the 60s. We've had Phil Klass. We've had Carl Sagan, Robert Schaefer, Seth Shostak. Going up to the present day, we have Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, I can't help but wonder if there hasn't been a long-term effort, to keep UFOs under wraps in the public mind, and maybe while at the same time monitoring the UFO community and finding out what's going on there.
Well, the big question to that is, why would they try to suppress this information or discredit the information that's out there?
There's another fascinating article. I just ran across it today in Jerry Clark's UFO Encyclopedia. But the idea being that General Sanford in 1952, and he was the one I think that had to go before the public and explain these UFO sightings over Washington. But General Sanford wanted to get out of the business of witness testimony. They wanted to get hard data, but to get the hard data about entry and exit of UFOs, they needed spy satellites, I'd say, or surveillance satellites. Well, in 1952, I mean, they didn't even launch a satellite, I think, until 1959 or the late 50s after Sputnik. And so it wasn't until the late 60s that the Air Force and the CIA had satellites that could do that. Okay, and and it was then that they had Edward Condon run his study and then publish their findings, poo-pooing the whole UFO problem. So that to me is a fascinating development, and I would like to get more documentation on that. I'm going to pursue that.
When you started talking about the Condon report, that was the report that basically was the reason for disbanding the Project Blue Book. And out of Project Blue Book, we got what the UFO community considers one of the most important personalities in all of ufology, and that's Alan Hynek, Dr. Alan Hynek. I recently saw a post by somebody, and I did not have a chance to look into this, but they were claiming that Dr. Hynek was involved with putting false information on Paul Benowitz's computer. Have you heard anything about this?
Yes, that is a story that's been told. That story comes from Bill Moore, and I think they were at a UFO convention, and they went out to lunch, and Bill Moore claims that Dr. Hynek told him that. And there are stories that Benowitz was seeing alien communications on his computer and all of this. Now, we don't know. I mean, it's a story, it's a claim, but I think that there's certainly a possibility. Benowitz was being looked at both by AFOSI and the NSA, and possibly others. And Richard Doty, as we know, had befriended Paul Benowitz. I think they spent a fair amount of time together talking about things. And with all of this intrigue swirling around Benowitz, it's not inconceivable that they might have introduced a computer into the situation. Now, why would they do that? It's so that the signals that Benowitz is collecting is being somehow changed into what he thinks is alien communications. And it may have been an aspect of, playing Benowitz in the situation.
Okay, and if that story about Alan Hynek is true, he's one of the pillars of the UFO community. If he's an active disinformation agent feeding false information to an unsuspecting researcher, scientist, what are the implications of that?
I think we want to remember that we don't have any proof of this. But I think we also need to remember that Hynek had been contracted to serve the Air Force's UFO project as an astronomer. And I think he retained that. I think he retained some relationship with the Air Force, maybe even into the 1980s. And who knows, maybe he was asked to do something like that. But we don't have proof. It's just a claim that hasn't been verified.
Well, I think it's hard to talk about that as a possibility without talking about what kind of damage could that do to the entire study of ufology. If that were true, I mean, that would be one of the biggest one of the biggest I can't think of the word, but it would be the most wrong thing ever for him, being the person that he is and how well he's known, to actually do something like that.
Well, it doesn't sound very pretty, but I think people overlook the fact that Benowitz was monitoring things on Kirtland Air Force Base. And he really had no business doing that. And the security people and whatever alphabet agencies, decided to handle it the way they did. And maybe that wasn't the best way to do it, but that's what they decided. And people that were executing all of this were following orders. They were doing what they were told to do. And that sometimes, look at it this way. If you've ever been close to an Air Force base, there's always a fence, and there's a sign that says basically "Do not enter." If you set up a card table and a lawn chair and put a bunch of binoculars on the table and all kinds of electronic equipment, yes, you're outside the base, but how long are you going to be able to do that, watching everything and capturing electronic signals and listening in on pilot conversations? How long do you think you're going to be able to do that before somebody comes over and has a little talk with you? And that's basically what Benowitz was doing. Now, he lived right next to Kirtland Air Force Base. And he had telescopes, he had cameras, he had electronic equipment, he had scientific equipment that he could record changes in magnetic fields. And Doty says that he had stumbled onto this high-tech, highly classified laser program where they were using lasers at Kirtland and at Area 51 to blind Soviet satellites. Benowitz had stumbled onto that. He probably didn't realize it. He thought he was looking at UFOs. And Kirtland, I don't know about these days, I haven't checked into it, but Kirtland was a hub of all kinds of highly classified programs at the time.
Well, but isn't Kirtland also the base where supposedly the alleged debris was taken from Roswell?
It depends on who you talk to and, what version you want to believe. But, of course, the conventional wisdom has always been in the UFO community that the debris was taken to, or the remains were, the saucer and maybe the bodies were taken to Wright-Patterson.
But via Kirtland, it went through. It had to be flown out of somewhere, so it went to Kirtland first, and then was flown out from there.
Possibly, or it could have gone down to Alamogordo. Down to what is Holloman Air Force Base now. Those are two logical places. Los Alamos has been mentioned, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So, well, the Benowitz case. The way it turned out was, it could have been handled differently. It should have been handled differently, but that's what we're left with. I was just thinking if Dr. Hynek was working with the government at that time, it doesn't really feel right. It just doesn't feel right that he was doing an active disinformation campaign against a fellow scientist, while he's also basically the face of ufology.
If you read Jacques Vallée's diaries, Jacques Vallée more than once asked Alan Hynek why was he continuing to work with the Air Force when they obviously weren't interested in doing any real scientific investigations. And Hynek's answer, as I remember, was, well, he didn't want to lose the connection there. And he felt like, he was at least getting some information, from having that relationship, and he was reluctant to cut ties completely.
Okay, well, we'll leave that part of the conversation for another time, and move on. So we talked about the Robertson panel, which was pre Blue Book, right? I mean that took place in the early 50s. You said. When did Blue Book start up?
Not long after that, either at that time or not long after that.
Okay.
And there's the theory that Blue Book was mainly a public relations exercise and an opportunity to debunk most of these sightings. Now, the Air Force had been finding up to that point that they could explain about 80%, 90% of the sightings of the reports. And publicly they were saying that if they had more information, they could explain all of them. But I don't think that was really the case. And I think the Air Force relationship with the UFO problem is complex. And, I think we have to remember that the Air Force's job is to protect the United States from foreign adversaries. And maybe there was, a strain of thinking in there. I mean, if you look at the early 50s, the Cold War was really getting revved up, and they were trying to build up SAC, the Strategic Air Command. They felt a tremendous responsibility to protect the United States from, a Soviet attack. And they were just going great guns and building up this whole infrastructure. The radar perimeters in Canada and the northern United States. So they had a lot to do other than be concerned with UFOs. But what we suspect, and what may be true, is that maybe there were some saucer crashes. Maybe there were some saucer recoveries. Maybe there were landings. Maybe there were incidents on U.S. Air Force bases and other military bases. This is stuff they don't, if they happen, they don't talk about that publicly. It's most all of it's classified. So, the Air Force, I think, if half of what we're hearing about these saucer recoveries is true, then the Air Force had a very complex relationship with the UFO problem.
Well, it doesn't seem like the Air Force has ever come out publicly and admitted that the UFO problem is real. The Navy, on the other hand, or the Department of Defense, more specifically, has admitted that. Right? So where does the Air Force sit on this part of the conversation? Are they still in denial, or are they just keeping out of the conversation altogether? Where do they stand on it right now?
Well, I think that they'll investigate and be concerned if something is affecting their operations. Like if a UFO lands on an airstrip at one of their bases, they're going to obviously be concerned with something like that. But that's, I think, from the Air Force brass, that's considered to be an internal matter, and it's really not the public's business. And like I said before, and anyone watches this knows that the government is besieged with FOIA requests. So the Air Force doesn't want to pour gas on the fire by releasing information that will just stoke the flames. So they, it doesn't surprise me in the least that since these videos came out, about the Navy activities, the Air Force has said probably, I think, as far as I know, absolutely nothing. and they don't want to get into that.
Oh, I mean, it's kind of obvious that they're staying out of the conversation completely. But as far as the internal matters idea, if why would they even try to do something like Project Blue Book to discredit civilian sightings? To try to debunk civilian sightings. Why get into all of that if their stance is that what happens on military bases is none of the public's business. So that's their stance. Why go out and investigate civilian sightings and try to debunk those?
You could see it as a public relations exercise. If they have a somewhat prominent role on the public side of it, they have more of ability to control the narrative. So the reporters run up to the Air Force spokesperson and ask about this latest UFO sighting, and they say, oh, the person saw Venus, or the person saw a weather balloon. That puts them in a position to be more in control of the narrative. But there did come a time when they wanted to officially get out of it publicly. That doesn't mean they weren't doing some investigating on their own, with things that affected them directly. But after the Condon report, I think if you wrote a letter to the Air Force and said, what about UFOs, they'd send you a fact sheet or a form letter, or a very simple statement that after many years of study and investigation, the Air Force has found that UFOs are not a threat to national security. Now, the Air Force is concerned with national security. And since, rightly or wrongly, they're saying that UFOs are not a threat to national security, then, not to worry. Nothing to see here.
And I'm going to push back a little bit on that because in your analysis of the projects or the operations that have been in place since the beginning, or I should say since 1947 when the Roswell incident happened, one of the goals of these programs is to obfuscate, confuse, and I think you used it in the last episode we talked about, to create a fog of confusion within the community of researchers and investigators who might actually be finding answers to these questions that are, what are these things, where are they coming from, how do they get here? So how does that weigh in on national security by trying to sow this disinformation to confuse people, and when national security is their goal?
Well, let's take a hypothetical what if that Roswell really happened. Okay, it really involved what some say are two ET craft and recovered bodies. Let's say that really happened, and then for some reason they post a story in the local paper saying they recovered a flying saucer, and then the next day they come out and say, no, it was just a weather balloon. So the press goes home, they forget about it, and nobody even thinks about the Roswell incident, hardly at all, until the late 1970s when Bill Moore and Stanton Friedman started looking into it. And this little book called The Roswell Incident came out in 1980. Then all of a sudden, UFO researchers start researching, UFO investigators start researching Roswell. Now, I've mentioned these ideas that maybe the UFO group should be monitored. So maybe the Air Force or whoever, whatever national security structure was in place and that was responsible for, the Roswell recovery and the management of the problem. They very possibly knew that this was going on. This book had been published. Researchers were getting closer to the truth. So maybe a program needed to be initiated. Because if the national security people, whoever they are, whether it's the president or the National Security Council or a secret committee like MJ-12 attached to the National Security Council, or top-level people in, the military and intelligence agencies and some kind of matrix arrangement, whoever was responsible for that, and if it really had happened, and they're not ready for the public to really believe it, then they have to take countermeasures. Okay? So they plant stories, they plant rumors, they recruit UFO researchers, they plant phony documents, they use a couple of people that are gullible to spread wild rumors and tales, and pretty soon you have a big mess. And let me ask you this, Andrew. Do you ever feel like you don't know what to believe?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I do know what I do believe, but if I listen to the official storyline or talking points, no. What I believe is probably about 10% of it is a possibility of what I believe is being true. But I discount most of what I hear from official channels because it's not. They have been for the entire time that since Roswell, they've been feeding disinformation into the public conversation about UFOs. But my question was, how does that fit into their agenda of national security by discrediting UFO researchers or feeding them disinformation to sow this fog of confusion? And you said it because the interest picked up after the book came out by Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore. But that disinformation campaign goes back prior to that during the Project Blue Book, and even before that with potentially the Roswell incident. So the disinformation has been out there, and if they're the reason that the government has been pushing the disinformation out there is for national security, how does that fit into their role as providing national security?
Well, first of all, in terms of if they have recovered a real saucer and bodies and all that, it depends on your definition of national security. Okay? Now, national security is just as much the well-being of society and the economy as it is in facing threats from foreign adversaries. So if you have a scenario where if certain information got out and the population had no choice but to believe that it was true, then you might have a scenario where there could be economic implications, there could be societal implications, there could be political implications. So I think if we put ourselves in the position of the top people, the National Security Council and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the directors of these intelligence agencies, and if they're in on this inside information about crashed craft, then they see it. I'm sure they see the disclosure of such as a true national security issue. And then there's a side issue of they don't want foreign adversaries to know that. Even though I assume that foreign adversaries probably know more than you and I know as average citizens.
Yeah.
So now, and then in terms of national security, if it's the Air Force's mission to protect us in the eventuality of a war, and they don't want to be distracted by UFOs because they don't see that as being their mission, then it makes logical sense they're going to try to minimize that to the extent that they can. Thus, you have a debunking exercise, and maybe some people are discredited along the way. And maybe if a pilot reports a UFO, he's debriefed for 2 days, and he's given a desk job, and you tamp this whole controversy down as much as you can.
That's a pretty good way to explain it. I still don't. I mean, I must be missing something because it doesn't seem to me like the UFO. I mean, unless you buy into the threat narrative that some people are pushing right now, that the UFO problem is a threat to our military assets and facilities, which it could be. It could be a threat. I have been on the fence about that. At times, I think, yes, it is a threat because if there's an accidental collision with one of these things, then that could result in loss of life or loss of equipment or whatever. That is considered a threat. But a threat to our way of life, a threat to the population, the majority of the population. I'm not quite there yet. I'm not convinced that these things are an active threat to our way of life or to our country.
Well, if half of what we've heard is true, we probably have alien groups that are friendly to us. We have alien groups that are neutral, and we have alien groups that are hostile. And if that's the case, then there is an element of threat in there. We, as citizens, we don't have enough information, in my humble opinion. We don't have the documentation that's sitting in vaults and in safes that is the record of all of this, of everything that has been known. And I don't think we're really in a position to know to what degree it is or is not a threat. But if the stories that we hear about abductions are true, I mean, that's not a happy thing, is it? I don't think. And
no, but
that's just one aspect of it.
Right. No, I agree that the abduction problem is a real problem, and I've heard arguments from both sides that the reason they're doing it is to help us evolve, and then the other side of the argument is that they're doing it to experiment on people. Again, I don't know what the reason that these things are doing this, but as you said, we don't have enough information to know one way or the other. But the people who do are hoarding that information. Why not share the information with the American public so that we can get on board with the decisions that they're making? Because after all, are they not a government elected by us?
Well, in theory,
Okay.
okay. But I suspect, and I think a lot of us suspect, when it comes to state secrets, and then when it comes to national security, the government can basically do anything that it sees as being necessary. And if the powers that be, assuming that these things have happened and that they know about it, then perhaps the powers that be have decided that it's most necessary that this information be controlled in the way that it's being controlled. In other words, kept secret and being kept as highly classified. There's a strain of thinking. It's really not anything new, but if you follow Twitter and social media, there's this whole strain of thinking that the aliens are going to make everything right for us. You know, they're going to give us miracle technology. They're going to heal us of our diseases. We're going to grow spiritually. You know, society will have a brighter future. That may not be the case.
Mm-hmm.
There's an old adage: you shouldn't ask questions you don't want to hear the answers to. And maybe some of this is bad, and we really don't want to know unless we don't have any other choice but to know.
Well, see, that's where I disagree. I think, you know, for the people that are adults and feel that they're mature enough to hear this information, they should have a right to hear it. Now, maybe I'm naive for saying that and believing that way, but that's how I feel. You know, I feel that if I want to know what the truth is about this, if it's not a threat to national security, then why would they, you know, keep me from knowing that information? And
Well,
it's like this idea of national security is so vague. You know, they can throw anything that they want to under the umbrella of national security, and that in and of itself is a threat to national security, isn't it?
in principle, yes, but we crossed that road long, long ago.
Yeah,
That Rubicon was crossed probably at World War II.
I agree. Yep.
And we're
So
way
maybe it's
past
a
really being able to get past that.
yeah, maybe that's a moot argument, and I'm all for, you know, arguing if there's something to be gained from it. But if talking about it just to talk about something, you know, while it could be an interesting conversation, at the end of the day, are we going to really even move the needle? And at this point, I don't feel like we will. Now, there are some things that people are doing that are effective, and I think that are moving the needle. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about that right now, real quick. There's a program by Luis Jimenez, who is also a YouTube channel, Unidentified Celebrity Review. He started a program called The Big Phone Home. And what he's doing is trying to get as many people to participate in a big push to call Congress, representatives, and talk about the UFO issue and the get more information from the U.S. government. I think that's a great project. I'm on board with it 100%. And he was a guest on this channel a couple weeks ago. But there's a lot of information that you can find about him on Twitter, YouTube. I guess the best place to go to is his YouTube channel, and it's the Unidentified Celebrity Review YouTube channel. There is a organization called the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It's a group of scientists that are looking at cases with hard evidence. They're writing up papers and submitting them for scientific review. I think that is a huge effort to try to figure out what these things are, how they operate. And you know, it's beyond the idea of trying to prove whether or not these things are real. It's a matter of now trying to figure out what they are, how they got here, and why they're here in the first place, right?
Uh-huh.
Do you
No, they do great work. They do fantastic work.
yeah, Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. And then the other group that I like to support and try to plug them on every episode is the Sky Hub program. And this is basically a citizens or a crowdsourced science project where anybody with the the means and the ability to build a Sky Hub unit, buy the components, put it together based on their specs, and you put this out on your rooftop, in your yard, in a secure location somewhere, or like Jeremy McGowan did, he put it on his vehicle so he could drive out into the desert and, you know, track these things. And all that data goes into a central database where it's available to the scientific community to be studied and help answer some of those questions that I was talking about before.
Yeah, that's a great project too. I know Bob McGuire.
Yeah, right. Bob McGuire is involved in that. There's a lot of people involved in both of those programs, and I think they're doing really good work. They're really pushing towards answering some of these questions without relying on the government to give us information on what these things are. Right. So
Yeah.
you know, it's important for people to push back against the government to get that information released because we have a right to know. You know, if it's not a threat to national security, if it doesn't compromise their ways and means of how that data was recovered, then the information should be made available to the public. And if it's not, why? National security just is not a good enough answer. And then, you know, these other organizations out there that are doing this, the scientific studies of these things to answer the questions. That's the direction I think we need to go. I think what you're doing is great because it really elevates the knowledge of people in the UFO community of what to be aware of when information is coming out of the U.S. government or official channels. You can't believe everything that they're putting out because they've proven in the past that they are willing to put out false information.
Well, and you may notice in this whole sequence of events since the Navy videos came out, and the whole controversy about Luis Elizondo and who is he really and what positions did he really have in the Pentagon, I think you've seen a pattern of conflicting information. I don't know if that's intentional or maybe they just don't have their act together, or maybe the spokesperson is getting conflicting orders, you know, from different parties. But this is not an uncommon phenomenon of getting conflicting information. I've mentioned FOIA several times and how the government's besieged with that. And that is really, I think, if you look at it from their side, they're really seeing that as an issue. And maybe behind the scenes, some people are asking questions like, well, why shouldn't we release this information? And I'm not referring to anything in particular, like a crash saucer or something. But do we really need to keep this classified? You know, maybe we can release this, and UFO people go crazy over a little something that's released, you know, through FOIA, and we can talk about that for 2 years, and then they can maybe release something else. You know, maybe a little bit of a strategy to keep us occupied and keep us busy. And God knows, at the slightest thing, the UFO community just goes haywire with debates and controversies and conflicts and all the things we're so familiar with.
Yes, that's true. The UFO community does a good job of confusing itself, and I've heard that argument a couple of times. But yeah, the current state of the disclosure, quote unquote disclosure, um, is a little bit in limbo. There's a report that's supposed to come out sometime in June, unless it gets pushed back. There's been some talk about pushing it back another 180 days, but I don't know if that's going to happen.
That doesn't surprise me in the least.
I think it is going to come out in June anyway, unless something happens. But what is your expectations, or what are your hopes versus your expectations for that report?
Well, naturally, we all hope to get something really juicy that we can sink our teeth into. I don't know what that would be. Hopefully, it might be some hard data, you know, like satellite tracking or radar tracking or infrared data or something, you know, that we can say, okay, now they have something here. What I expect is that what we will see will be relatively bland, and anything that really is interesting will be presented in a closed-door session to the Gang of Eight in Congress. And the reason why I chuckled a minute ago is, now if you look at it from the side of the people that have to come up with this report, I would think they're under a lot of pressure to produce this thing. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if they needed more time and they begged for an extension. So that's another semi-expectation that I have. We get ourselves so worked up about these things that we're really setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Right.
A lot of people are thinking this is going to be the big disclosure that's going to change everything. And when you set it up that way and it comes out, it's basically a nothing burger, then, you know, you're very, very disappointed and disillusioned and unhappy and frustrated. So, you know, why set ourselves up that way? Just wait and see what happens. But it seems like so many people in this field, they never look at it from the other side. You know, from the Pentagon's side, from the military side, and they have innumerable priorities that they have to attend to. And for them, for the most part, UFOs are not one of them. And this is being foisted on them. And let's hope that we get some good information about it, but let's not build ourselves up to some huge expectation and then we're just going to be frustrated and unhappy. I think we need to look
totally
at it realistically.
agree with you. No, I totally agree with that. You know, one of the things that I mentioned, Luis Jimenez, he was on the program a couple weeks ago, and he continuously kept saying, manage your expectations, manage your expectations. I think that's probably one of the most important things that people need to remember is that don't expect a lot from this. This is the first step. And they're not going to throw open the barn doors and say, "Here's the bodies, here's the craft." That's not going to happen. But the simple fact that there has been um, an order to bring this report to the public, that's a win in itself. So whatever comes out of that report is um, is going to be important information. It's not going to be groundbreaking. Might not be world changing information, but it's important information because it's a win for the side of those trying to push disclosure. And that's what people got to remember.
Well, in terms of analyzing it and evaluating it, you look at what they tell you and you look at what they don't tell you. And that
Yes,
tells you something.
that's
Those two
true.
things taken together.
What I'm curious to if you know. Okay, so in the world of speculation, okay, and the possibilities, if there is alien debris, or not alien debris, but UFO debris and alien bodies, or even a craft, okay, if they actually have something like this, what is the national security implications to keep that covered up?
There are two. One that I mentioned about the effect on society and the economy. That's one national security implication. The other is what our foreign adversaries know or don't know about how much progress we've made in understanding this advanced technology. And if it's true, if it exists, then whoever's in control of it has the reasons for, maintaining the wraps over it. A lot of information is leaking out, and maybe some of it's disinformation, maybe some of it's misinformation. But there have been a lot of points made, and there's been a lot of information that's come into the public domain. Are we being played into believing a lot of this stuff, or is there really truly a grain of truth to it?
Yeah, yeah. Uh, that is a big question. Now, I'm of the opinion that um, whatever UFOs are, they're absolutely real. There's something that is interacting with humans in a way that can't be explained. Um, and I usually leave my opinion out of this, man. So I'm going to stop right there and leave it at that. But there's something out there that we can't explain, and
Oh,
whether or
definitely.
not the government knows what it is, that's still that's still unknown, in my opinion. What is and we're getting long on time here, and I know it's late in your part of the world, so I'm gonna start to wind this down, but I just have a couple of other questions, and then we'll close it up. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Your just explain, what is your motivation? What is your driving factor that compels you to do this kind of research and write these papers that have so much information in them? What's your goal in doing that?
Well, I want to know who created the MJ-12 documents and why. And I don't care what the answer is. I just want to know the truth about it. Were they a pure hoax? Were they some kind of disinformation play? Were some people trying to get some information out into the public? So on and so forth. I want to know that. And that's my primary motivation. And at a deeper level, I think we all want to know are these rumors about, you know, recovered craft and bodies and technology and all of this. Is there any truth to that? I think we all want to know that, and what the work that I'm doing is just one approach to try to gain more insight into that whole issue. Those are the two main things that are driving me.
Okay. That's brings up another question, and every question that I have answered, believe me, we could be here all night because I have 10 questions off of the answers that I get. this is
Yeah.
what motivates me to do this. But Lou Elizondo put out on Twitter a couple weeks ago, maybe. What 3 questions would you want to be answered in the UAPTF report that comes out? Maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was something. What are the 3 most important issues that you could put to the government? I would have to look up that question. But did you happen to see that question that he put out?
I think I saw it briefly, but to kind of summarize it, I mean, if I could ask any, you know, if the government came out with a Ask Me Anything session, and with the assurance that they would tell the truth, then I'd want to know what we all want to know. Like I just said, you know, have they recovered saucers? How aware are they of the ET presence? What evidence do they have? How is all of this being kept secret? What's the national security structure that runs it? Has there been, or has there ever been, a committee like MJ-12 or something like it? Did it start out that way? I'd ask. That's what I want to know. Now, you take experiencers and abductees, and they probably want to know, why am I being abducted? You know,
Yeah.
Who's doing it? And why are they doing that? What do they want? But I'm not an abductee. I'm not an experiencer.
Have you ever seen a craft, an unidentified craft?
No. And if you don't want to see one, then hang out with me. I think you're pretty safe.
I'm the same way. I have never seen one. I've talked to so many people that have, and it seems to be, for the people that have seen it, it's some kind of a life-changing experience, because it drives people to basically do anything they can to find answers about this phenomenon, about what it is. And you know, as I said, I've never had that experience, but I'm still really interested to hear what people have uncovered, you know, in their pursuit for these answers. So that's what motivates me, even though I've never had an abduction experience or a sighting. You know, and I to be honest with you, I don't really want to be abducted. I think it would be cool to see a craft, but if that comes with the possibility of getting abducted, no thanks. I don't want to get abducted.
Well, you know, you start out in this. I started out in this at the age of 12 years old, you know, taking an interest in it. And back in those days, you know, you're naive and you think, boy, I wish I could see a flying saucer. And then in the 80s and 90s, you start hearing about all these abductions. And then my whole attitude changed. It's like, I don't want to see a flying saucer.
Right. And maybe that's why we haven't. I don't know. But I see a lot of people that have experienced sightings, you know, multiple sightings or abductions. It's been in a lot of cases it's been hereditary. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's been like their family, their parents or their grandparents have experienced it. They're experiencing it, and then their children experience it eventually.
Yeah, it runs in
and
families.
yeah, it runs in families. And in a lot of cases, it's been a lifelong experience for people. Uh,
And there
but
could be different groups doing that.
that's
It may
true.
not be just one group,
Yeah.
and different groups may be doing it for different reasons.
Yeah, and that's a rabbit hole that could take another couple of hours to talk about that, because that's really where you get into the realm of speculation. And so far, we've been pretty good about staying on topic, and not traveling outside the boundaries of what can be proven with documents. But maybe we could do that another time. I know you're going to continue your research, and it looks like you have a new paper that you're already putting in the works and getting ready to publish. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your plans are and what your next project is going to be?
Yeah, the project I'm working on now, it's tentatively titled MJ-12 Psychological Warfare and Strategic Deception. And on the original MJ-12 list, there were Gordon Gray was the first director of the Psychological Strategy Board. Is one alleged MJ-12 member. Another person, another alleged MJ-12 member was Lloyd Berkner, and he was on the Robertson panel. And James Carrion, UFO researcher, the former executive director of MUFON, he's done a tremendous amount of research and writing, and he implicates Vannevar Bush in psychological warfare and strategic deception activities. So that's one part of it. I've been in the process of going through all of the MJ-12 documents that are on the majesticdocuments.com website and turning up any other direct or indirect associations with psychological warfare. And now all these documents are question documents, all right, and I want people to understand that, but I'm looking at it at the MJ-12 and the UFO history from the angle of how psychological warfare and or strategic deception may be related to it one way or another.
Right. Right. Now, I think we have a few people watching, and if anybody has any last questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll share it with Tom so that he can answer those questions. Because we're really getting ready to wind this down and close it out.
I'll be
But
glad to answer questions. I'd love to answer questions.
absolutely, yeah. In the meantime, while we're waiting, because there's a little bit of a delay, so until we get some questions, if we get some questions, why don't you let people know how they can contact you and how they can see what you're working on, and give them all your contacts.
Okay. My blog site is tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. That's tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. And I post a weekly update, which is an update on my research and reading activities. And it has the two papers posted on that blog, the one that is MJ-12, the counterintelligence angle, and the before MJ-12 paper. Those are both on the blog. I'm also on Twitter, @TomTulsa. That's @TomTulsa. And I'm on Facebook as Tom Whitmore.
Okay. So if somebody wanted to contact you directly, should they use Facebook or Twitter to reach out?
They can. My email is twhitmore87@gmail.com. That's twhitmore87@gmail.com. So that's, 1, 2, 3, 4 ways to contact me.
Okay, cool. Well, if is there anything you'd like to mention before we Undead Gaucho just said thank you for the work that you're doing. He's going to check out your blog. He was on the live stream. He's also a YouTube UFO researcher, and he was on. He was a guest on my channel Saturday night. Awesome dude, does good research and has really interesting insights about the UFO topic.
Thank you, Undead Gaucho.
Right. And so is there anything else you'd like to say, Tom, before we close this out?
The only thing I have left to say is let's keep calm and carry on.
Oh, here we go. What's your take on Greer's approach that the phenomena poses no threat? Well, I think that's not only Greer's. That's not just a Greer perspective. I think there's a lot of people that feel that way. So to be fair, take the Greer part of it out of the question. But what is your opinion about that? Is it a threat or not a threat?
This gets back to my earlier comment of this type of thinking that the aliens they're our space brothers. They're going to help us. They're going to give us great technology. They're going to cure disease. They're going to help us grow spiritually. We're going to advance as a civilization. And I think that's a psychological need that some people, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm talking down, but to me it seems like a psychological need that some people have, that, they've got to be the good guys. And like I said earlier, we don't really have enough information to know that for sure. I'm not saying they're a threat. I'm not saying they're our space brothers.
Yeah, a lot of the people that have been abducted believe that these things are just completely indifferent to human emotion. They don't really care about us. They're just more of a curiosity to them. We are a curiosity to them. So it could be any number of things, really. That's a tough question. I think that there is more to it than just they're benevolent beings here to help us evolve and go to the next level. I think there's way more to it than that. That's kind of an oversimplistic viewpoint of it, in my opinion. Because, like you said, the abduction part of it is real, and it's not a happy experience for most of the people that have had that.
True.
Thanks for that question, Undead Gaucho, man. That's a good question.
Thanks, Undead Gaucho.
And I think with that, I don't see any other questions here. But thank you, everybody who was watching and participating. You guys are awesome for being here. Thank you, Tom, so much for your time and sharing your insight and experience. The invitation is always open for you to come back. So when your next paper comes out, if you want to jump back on and do a quick update, that's open.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew, so much for having me on. I do appreciate it very much.
Oh yeah, always. And so until next time, I think we've pretty much covered everything.
We'll be in touch, all right?
All right, Tom. Thanks again, man. Take care.